Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. This happens to be our third opportunity to meet with the Workman Quad and dig deeper into math. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be here in person, but hopefully this recording serves its purpose and allows us to be able to further our math journey together. So our focus today is really just on a few different things, all centered around math. But I wanted to start off by a focus on what's working. So we know that we talked about in our first go around unfinished learning and some of the things that we in the classroom could be able to do to best support some of that unfinished learning. But I do recognize and acknowledge the fact that all of us are doing wonderful things. And a lot of times we're just so unsure whether what we are doing is unique and different than what's happening in classrooms either next door to us or classrooms across the district. And so I do want to give an opportunity and a space to lift up all those wonderful voices and things that you may be doing in the classroom. So go ahead and, if you wouldn't mind, either unmuting and sharing, or if you feel more comfortable, placing in the chat, but just essentially answering what are some things you are doing or have done to be able to support the unfinished learning that's across the district with regards to math. Thank you so much for those of you that felt comfortable enough to share. Again, if you didn't share something, please be sure to share amongst your colleagues. I know that all too often as teachers, we're always so unsure as to what we are doing, what makes it special, but we acknowledge that every one of us is doing amazing things. And we know that by working in silos, we're not necessarily helping all students learn to their fullest. So please be willing to share either something that you are doing with some grade level colleagues, just to make sure that we understand, there are some amazing things happening everywhere you go. So our goals for today, in our brief time together, really we're going to try to dig deeper into data. So I know when I'm working with the other grade levels, we're going to be looking at SBAC, but for us, one of the big components we have in terms of the district available assessments platforms is our SMAP. And so I want us to dig deeper into that. I also would like for us to prioritize the remaining portion of instruction. With the amount of time we have left, where are we going to spend the most of our time? So SMAP. You may have seen this before and maybe you hadn't yet. I know I'm working with some teachers, some are further along with their understanding of enable pull data to dig into data. And so I acknowledge that everyone is different places. But this first one we're looking at is with regards to the class report. And so the class report might be a great way to start off to kind of see what were some of the strengths of your particular class. But I also think it's a good opportunity for you to be able to see the breakdown individually by students. So in addition to this overall view, if you will, the class report is also going to provide us with the students as well as their individual RIT score if you progress further into the class report. Now, if you look on the far right side by the columns, you'll see that it's telling us whether our students are performing high or low to each of these respective instructional areas. And that's something that I really want us to focus on is the instructional area. And we know, if we look at our standards, we'd look at more so domains. But when we talk about the environment and the platform, whether it is NWEA, they refer to these as instructional areas. So they have the 4 instruction areas, and you can see in the upper right corner, we're talking about OA, or operations and algebraic thinking, numbers and operations, measurement and data, as well as geometry. So those are those 4 instruction areas that NWEA alludes to. Now, this might be helpful, but I think that if we're probably using this to the fullest, I think many might prefer to look at the other option. Again, this is the same report, the class report, but as opposed to looking at how did my students perform in each of these respective instruction areas, here what you're seeing is the actual RIT score for each of these instruction areas. Now, if you look at that very first student as an example, we can see that they're scored 154. So I'll go ahead and place it right here so you can see 154. But if you contrast that with how do they perform at each of these respective instruction areas. So we can see right here, there was a range, right, for this first one, operations and algebraic thinking, the student scored between 163 and 177. And then you can see each of these ranges for these other instructional areas. So I think this might be helpful if you were trying to use this data for some other things to be able to kind of see maybe what were my strengths of an individual student or as a class, and what are some areas that we maybe either need to spend more time, or maybe that we can congratulate ourselves for the time well spent on certain areas that your students as a whole may have performed better in than others. So again, that's the class report, which I think in my going around and working with certain groups of teachers, this is probably one of the most common reports I've seen be pulled. This is another one. I was working with some administrators and we talked about looking at a zoomed out view, also talking about the instruction area, but this is by RIT score where you're seeing the whole class. So rather than seeing maybe individual, what did each student perform, here you're going to get chunks. And I think this might be helpful if you're trying to say, okay, I'm thinking about operations algebraic thinking, that first instruction area. As a whole, where did the majority of my students fall in terms of their score? Do I have most of my class that is scoring possibly in the 191 to 200 bracket or that range? Or contrast that, maybe you have as a whole, your classes may be struggling or having a more challenging time with that particular instructional area. So again, what we're looking at is the breakdown by instruction area report. And this is different than the first one we saw. But this one might be beneficial to zoom out and see where are the bulk of my students in terms of each of these various instruction areas. Now, if you're seeing, hey, I see some of my, or the bulk of my class in this particular instruction area might be further along, also consider what had you already covered thus far. Now we know that when we look at the actual SMAP, we're looking at all standards. And we understand that you hadn't taught yet all standards by the time you administered this second SMAP assessment. So again, take into consideration when you're looking at the strengths and or areas that have the most room for improvement, what had you versus what had you not had a chance yet to cover. So it may be, for example, maybe you have lower scores potentially in, let's say that last example, geometry, but maybe you hadn't yet covered that, which may be the reason, or at least a reason, why you have more students that are having a more challenging time with that. So again, this might be a beneficial opportunity to zoom out and see by instruction area, where is the majority of your class falling? Now, if you wanted to dive deeper into where your students are performing, I might suggest by looking at the learning continuum, we're not going to explore that because it does give you very detailed by instruction area. What are some of the concepts that your students are most ready to take on? And they kind of look at it through the zone of proximal development or the ZPD, kind of where are the bulk of your kiddos ready for, depending upon their RIT score. And then the last one that I think really I find draws some wonderful conversations is the idea of looking at growth. And so what this is providing us to us is a quadrant. And ideally you would want the bulk of your class to be scoring either in that upper yellow or orange and or that green. And essentially what we're talking about is regardless of whether your students come to you potentially as performing high or maybe having a more challenging time performing low, we always acknowledge the idea and the main goal is for us to always at the end of the day have growth. And so we want our students to be growing regardless of where they came to us at when they entered our rooms. Ideally would like to see them continue to grow. So again, what you're hoping for as you look in these four quadrants is, are my students high achieving and also growing at a high rate, which would make them fall into the upper green quadrant? And then also, might your students be potentially having a challenging time? Maybe they're performing low, but at the same time, they're still making a lot of tremendous gains or growth. That would put them in that upper orange quadrant. And then the one we probably would not want to see is that lower pink quadrant. And that's to indicate that our students potentially are not only performing low, but also maybe not growing at the same rate that we might like. Again, take this with a grain of salt. We all acknowledge the fact that we are still dealing with a lot of the unfinished learning that transpired over the course of the pandemic. I was meeting with the teacher the other day. She said, you know, we have to remind ourselves that our students were impacted for 1 year when they had either the lost instruction or at least lost the same extent of quality instruction. And I had to point out, you know what, we're not talking about 1 year. We're talking about a course of 3 years, whether it was the first year when we were impacted, the second year, at least in HLPUSD, when we were fully remote, and or that third year, which was last year, most recently, where we had both teachers and students out at tremendous rates, depending upon where you were at. So again, just bear in mind that obviously we acknowledge that we know that our students aren't necessarily at the same place we might like, but we also could use this potentially to have some wonderful conversations about, hey, what are some things that you are doing that is leading to either more growth in any of the respective areas? So again, this 4 quadrants is the growth, but it's a great way to look at where is my class at with regards to their growth over from first one to the second go around for SMAP. Now, the big thing to keep in mind is that you're not going to see the biggest really true indicators until you look at both the first assessment all the way until the end or the final SMAP that you would be administering. So just bear in mind that although we are looking at growth, I think this would probably be the most beneficial when comparing both the first administration for the first one in the fall to the final one that you'll be administering in the spring. But if you hadn't looked at this growth summary quadrant, I think it's a fantastic place to start. So let's go ahead and take a look at where you might access these and where you would go. And so of course, we're going to go to ClassLink and then NWEA. And so if you've already seen these before, please be patient because I'm sure there might be some colleagues who hadn't yet. So from here in ClassLink, we're going to want to find the icon that looks something like this. It says Teacher NWA for SMAP. Again, a little white icon with NWA letters. I'm going to click on that, and it's going to launch. Now my interface might look slightly different, being of the permissions that I have. Now, okay that. But essentially, we're all going to the same place, which is we're looking at the MAP growth reports. And from here, that first one we lingered on was the class report. So again, you could click on the sample report so you have an idea, but for the purpose of just demoing where to go and how to go about it, I'm going to click on class report. I'm going to ensure that my term rostered is what I in fact want. For yourself, you're probably not going to see all the options that I see next for schools, but I'm going to go to quickly click on that, and then we'll click on the last portion that is pertaining to you. So once you've selected, you're going to want to give the option in terms of what assessment we're looking for. Because we're focusing today on math, I'm going to go ahead and clear all the other remaining assessments and only click on the math so that we're only focused on that one. Now down below you have other options. Now one of the options is by default the area descriptors, and that's that first sample that I showed you where it's going to tell you by instruction area, are they performing high or low in each of those respective instruction areas. But I think that most of us would probably prefer to go the route of instruction area RIT ranges, and that's going to tell you the individual RIT score or RIT range for that student based on how they performed on that assessment. So again, just a simple toggle there, and all the rest of these are defaulted as is, so I'm not going to make changes there. And I'm going to click on Create PDF Report. I'm going to let it run its magic, and then we will be able to view what is yielded. Again, this first one is going to be able to show us right here by looking at kind of as a zoomed out, very much so, how did my students perform on the assessment, and by each of these, again, as I go to the next one, instructional areas, how do they perform respectively. And then the very last page that I'm not going to go through is where it's going to tell you the student individual name as well as the RIT score they earned for each of their respective instructional areas. So again, this is the class report, which is probably by far the one I see most commonly used in classrooms. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. Going to go back to math growth reports. And then that next one we looked at was the class breakdown by instruction area. So it's right here. It's a little bit lower. I'm going to go in and click on that. Same idea. You're going to want to make sure you have the proper assessment selected. Most recent one we administered was in the winter. You should have these options in terms of the school, but I'm going to go ahead and quickly select those. Now, again, you have these options. Now, it wants to know, do we want to look at the score breakdown by class by RIT? By instruction area, our projected proficiency. That proficiency projection would be more so for how we think they're likely to perform on the summative assessment. In this case, for us, SBAC, we, for our purposes, are going to look at the instructional area. And then it does ask what assessment or what course are we looking at, Math K-12. And you could either create the PDF or view report online. Again, I'm going to go the route of creating PDF. And here I have it. I finally have my class breakdown. And again, you're looking at the very top. These are those bands or those ranges for those RIT scores. And what I would be considering is where are the bulk of my students performing. You could look at all areas, or you might just focus on kind of maybe those most important sections or instructional areas. And for many of us, that's operations, algebraic thinking, in addition to numbers and operations. And so again, just looking at where are the bulk of my students falling with regards to their score on the second go around. I'm going to go ahead and go back. And then that last one we're going to look at is the one that I found that sparks the most conversation. In fact, I had a teacher the other day that I was working with say to a colleague, you know, hey, what is it that you are doing? Because I noticed that you are having maybe more of the scores I might want. And so I just think it's an excellent opportunity to open up those conversations. Like, what are you doing so that we can kind of glean and take away or borrow some of those effective strategies that our colleagues are already implementing. So again, here's that last one, which is the achievement status and growth by quadrant. And you should notice it by looking at those 4 squares. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Same thing, we're always looking at the term that's right. Now it says comparison period. You're always going to want to ensure that you're selecting from fall, that's the first go around, to current. So again, don't be too alarmed when you see a default to the fall. That's what we're comparing our data to. I'm going to go ahead and click Create Report. And as you look at it, you'll notice that it has all of the areas of the assessment that we used. So because we're purposely being specific for math, I'm going to remove for the time being language arts, and I'm only looking at math. And each of those squares is to indicate an individual student and where they performed. Again, my goal is not to say, hey, oh my goodness, you have so many students in this one area, but rather hopefully to prompt and promote some conversations in terms of what might some of us already be doing to end up with the most ideal or most preferred results. So again, this is the quadrant. And again, we really do want to emphasize that we're ideally looking for our students to be falling above either in that orange or in that green section, because that's to indicate to us that the growth is being made that we would like to see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go away from that. So hopefully through looking at some of those reports, you feel at least a little bit more comfortable in understanding not only what are the reports that we might be encouraging or recommending, but also considering how you might be able to dig deeper into the data to be able to pull out the information that's most meaningful and relevant to you and your classroom. So now that we've talked about pulling out data, the next part is to talk about what are we doing with that data. Now I know some of you may be doing different things, but I think one of the fantastic places to start is by leveraging Dreambox. And so if you weren't already aware, Dreambox has the ability for us to be able to take what students performed in their SMAP or their NWEA and be able to plug both those scores in as well as the domain that we want kids to focus on, and then it will generate assignments. So we know that students inside of Dreambox really have these two options in terms of them going on their own self-selected path versus us as teachers assigning content for them. And so while we know if we look through the lens of if an individual happened to be injured or was trying to get back into shape or back into wherever they might be if they were coming back from an injury, which of the two options in terms of the rehab process might be a little bit more effective for our students? And so again, could they go on their own self-selected path in Dreambox? Absolutely. But if we are leveraging not only what we know is best, but also the most recent assessment data from SMAP into Dreambox, it's only going to accelerate and improve that much more for our students. So again, what you would do is you would come back to the idea of selecting what is the domain you want to focus on for individual students. And then for each individual student, you would select what is their RIT score. And based on how they performed, Dreambox will generate assignments. So there is a separate video that we've created. We're not going to delve too much into that, but just wanted to say that if you aren't already leveraging what Dreambox has available to us, you might want to start based on, adjusting to or making use of the most recent assessment data we have. Now, when you do focus on domains, while every single domain is important, I do want to point out what we would highly recommend, and those are those two areas that more pop up in terms of them being essential or a major cluster. So numbers and operations, as well as operations algebraic thinking would probably be the two that we really highly recommend. So now we've gone through in terms of looking at the data and talked about what you might do in terms of one resource for the data. Let's go ahead and focus on what we have left in terms of the remainder of the school year. So again, really want to highlight what we talked about in previous sessions. We talked about the importance of where to focus. Now, where to focus has these own documents, essential documents or essential standards is what we had alluded to them earlier. We'll take a look at what those are. We do want to bring back the idea of the pacing guide. So we understand everyone might be at different places right now at this point in the school year, but we do have these suggested pacing guides with some little bit of assistance or guidance, and I want to highlight that as well. And then the last thing is to look at what do we have left in terms of the remainder of the school year? How many weeks? And based on that, what are we going to spend the most amount of time on, right? What chapters do we still have to cover? And so let's focus on that. So the first thing we have right here are the where to focus. And so we can share out that link as well, but I will show you on the math website where you can access this. And this essentially just breaks down, right, for each of the respective chapters, which of those do happen to contain the major or most important standards, and which are containing the supporting clusters, and then as which ones are containing the additional clusters. So it's not to say that any of these are not important. What we are saying is some are more important, not only in terms of the overall coherence of things build up from grade to grade, but also consider to what is the most important thing kid needs to leave with success or understanding at your respective grade levels. If you want to scan that QR code, it will take you directly to the folder, but again, I will show you on the math website where you can access this. So the next thing we're looking at are the suggested pacing guides. So every grade level has their own. And what we did our best to do is to highlight so that you would see some of those things that are most important, whether this chapter or other chapters. So in addition to that, again, where to focus, document from Achieve the Core, we also have this. And these did pull some stuff from Achieve the Core. But what I do feel that this gives you is a little bit extra added bonus, is you're looking at some of the lessons that maybe aren't as critical to the overall success for that particular chapter. So you can see in the indication of the image there, 2 of the lessons. So in this case, sample for kindergarten, 6.5 and 6.6. Those are grayed out, and that's to say that we probably would suggest that you do not teach those particular lessons. In some cases, you also have some notes where it tells you just some things, overarching big ideas for that respective chapter. So again, these are the suggested pacing guides, also available on the math website, and I will show you where you could go to access this. As we wind down, one of the things I wanted to say is that, the reality is that many of us in the last remaining portion of the school year, even for most of the school year, all over the place, right, in terms of us trying to do what we consider to be best for our students. But I do really want to make sure we are saying that while you could, spend yourself a lot of time in a lot of different areas, there are some areas that maybe are the best use of our time, because I know the reality is all of us are working hard. We just want to make sure we're working hard on the right things. So this is not intent to be able to oh my goodness, that this is how much we have left, but just more of a reality check, right? So right now we are currently in the month of February. So if you think after the end of this week, we really have 6 more weeks left of instruction before we wrap up into spring break. So that first week of April for us in our district is spring break. And when we come back, you can see for that yellow indication right there, we're talking about that's most likely where you're going to be administering the 3rd round of SMAP. So again, we're talking about from after this week, we have 6 weeks of instruction before you administer the last and final round of SMAP. And then if you want to go further and really look at, well, how much of the rest of the school year, because I know I may not fit everything I need to fit in prior to spring break, right? Well, if you look at it through that lens, we're talking about a total of 12 weeks. So again, you have about 12 weeks left of instruction in total. Or if you want to approach it as before the next round of SMAP, you have about 6 weeks after this week of instruction. And that's not to say, oh my goodness, the sky is falling, but the reality is this is what we have left, and where are we going to spend the most or the best use of our time. So what I did do is to be able to do a little bit of the legwork for y'all, and I hope it's helpful. This is basically looking at the remaining chapters. Now I know some of you may be on chapter 8, or some of you may be in chapter whatever it happens to be. So I'm not saying where you are, but if you understand between the now and the end of the school year, I really looked at the last or back half of the curriculum. What are some of the most important areas? And I indicated that with a little icon here. And those are to say that these chapters contain the major clusters for your respective grade level. And then if you see that little smaller icon for highly recommended, those would be more your supporting. So again, that's not to say that the rest aren't important. It's just that what's most crucial for your respective grade level. And I did that for each grade. So here's kinder, here's 1st grade, and then here's 2nd grade. And I'm going to do is I'm going to put these inside of our suggested pacing guide or recommended pacing guide. So if you do happen to go to that document, at the very end, you'll see this slide right there. So that way, in case, again, it's going too fast, you didn't have a chance to see what it was, I'll go ahead and place those there. Okay. So what I wanted to wrap up with is an opportunity for us to collaborate, because I do believe firmly that the smartest person in the room is the room, right? The idea is that we learn best from one another and we help each other. And so I'm hoping that when we do a little bit of opportunity for our breakout rooms, that you'll have to be able to see, we can help each other out and talk about, what are the things that you are doing currently with the data? And then how are you planning to finish the school year? Because at the end of the day, we can't just say, hey, you know what? I'm moving at a slower pace, and so I'm in blank chapter. Well, let's really make sure we're looking at it. Is the chapter that you're spending more time in, is that something that's crucial to the success for your particular grade level? If it is, by all means, spend the time that it warrants. But if it's not, let's move into areas that are more important or more crucial to the overall success of my grade level. So again, you're going to have a chance to be able to choose your breakout room, to be able to go to the room and have some, I hope, beneficial conversations. And then I do want to make sure you understand the math website, and I want to show that now, where you would go to access some of these things. So let me go ahead and. So on the math website, if you're wondering where would you go to access the curriculum maps or the suggested pacing guides or those where to focus standards, we're going to come to where it says curriculum guides. And from here, we have several different documents. That first one that I talked about was the essential standards, or the where to focus standards. And this is where you're going to see where we put it out by grade level, where it says each of the respective chapters that are, where that particular cluster falls, right? So there's kinder, and there's first, and there's second. And then I'm going to go ahead and go back to the math website. In addition to that where to focus documents or essential standards, we also have the suggested pacing guide. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up for K5. And then here I'm going to open up, let's go ahead and use second grade as an example. And here you see where it says not only what is a priority standard that we've, again, that same document, right? But also some of the things that are most important. So I'm going to go ahead and jump down to, let's just say, chapter 6, if I can get there, or another later chapter. So here we go. Here's chapter 6.3, three-digit addition and subtraction. So again, this is just an example for second grade, but here you can see there are some lessons that we have suggest that you don't happen to cover, and then you do see some additional notes here where it tells you some big ideas or overarching things that are important and crucial for your grade level. So again, those are those two documents I hope you utilize and leverage as a resource, not only where to focus in terms of what chapters should you spend more time in or less, as well as the suggested pacing guide so you can get a better grasp on what lessons might not be as crucial to the overarching success of that particular chapter. We are here for a resource, so I know that you are going to go back in your rooms and hopefully have some powerful conversations, but I do want to make sure you understand that if there's something that you are wanting more support in, or maybe that you have some questions in, let us know. As a math team, we're happy to help, or at least share some of our thoughts just so that we're working together in the best way possible. Thank you so much.